And we're probably not going to be cheering so much for some of them, because you'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength, and you have to be strong.
But I'd be on that phone call every single day. I'd be up that guy's yin-yang so far with a firecracker he wouldn't know what hit him from Pfizer. I'd be outside that guy's house. Every time he moved, I'd be saying, where's our vaccines?
Change has come to Georgia. Yeah. Change is coming to America.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the LeanTossup podcast. This week, I'm going to be joined by my guest, Bradley Stewart. Hi, Bradley.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, too. And we're going to talk a bit more in depth about the 2020 U.S. election in terms of polling error and accuracy of the different models. Now, Bradley, on your website, if you want to give it a plug here, you talked about which was the most accurate 2020 election model. Do you want to explain about that?
Yeah, so, I've always been interested in sports and politics. So when the 2020 election rolled around, I decided I'll just create a model for fun because I'm big in statistics. And then, it just started off like with the Facebook page, and I tried to create a podcast, and then eventually I created a website to make sure I had my model like submitted online, if you would. And then after the election, I was surprised to see how accurate my model was compared to other models. So I created after most of the votes were counted, I created a article analyzing a number of different models in terms of accuracy and terms of the states and swing states, etc.
Yeah, you definitely beat us, that's for sure. All right. So going through your findings, so obviously you had the most accurate model. What were some of the other more accurate models?
Plural vote was a big one. The Princeton Electoral Constitutorum piece, they had a pretty accurate one. A lot of them were in the same type of range for errors, around like 4 points to 4.26 points. There's like 4 or 5 in that gap, but really plural vote was the other main one that stood out, along with the Stewart SP model.
So how how do you measure accuracy with the models? Just give everybody on here just a quick overview of how you. So you say you get a result. How do you assess its accuracy from a specific model?
Well, we did it in a number of ways. One of them was just taking the average projected margin of victory in a state. So if you projected Biden would win, we'll say Wisconsin by 5 points, and then Biden ended up winning by, we'll say, a point, the average error would be about a 4-point shift towards Biden. So that was one way. And then I also looked at Breyer scores for probability. If you said Biden had a 66% chance to win a state, and analyzed it based on that.
Yeah, so it's all really good analysis, and it is, at the end of the day, after the election, obviously, it's extremely important to go back and sift through and kind of figure out what went wrong, who was the strongest in terms of this stuff, and why. And now, obviously, a lot of people, myself included, maybe even you did really well, so maybe not to an extent you, but a lot of modelers will point to the polls and say the polls were wrong, that's why we were wrong. What do you think about that excuse? Do you think it's legitimate? Do you not think it's legitimate? What do you think?
I think it's kind of legitimate. The polls were wrong, but they were kind of wrong almost to the same extent as they were in 2016. So if you had a trust in the polls that they would figure it out this time around, then if you had a greater leaning on polls because you trusted that they would figure it out, it's kind of a reasonable excuse. But also, at this point, no, because you need the polling agencies really need to regain our trust, because why would we trust them if they're so wrong at projecting specifically the Trumpish presidential elections? Because they were accurate in 2018 for the most part with the midterms, so we had a sense, but they're not accurate at gauging Trump voters, which is an issue. And so I think models using polling as an excuse, it's kind of a double-edged sword because if you trust the polls and you use the polls for your model, I think you have to have some type of safety net because they need to regain our trust. And until they do that, from here on out, I think you can't really trust polls all that much. So I think it'll be interesting to see how pollsters specifically analyze upcoming elections and if forecasters will put more credence or less credence on those polls.
Yeah, I mean, I know for sure we're gonna like. Again, it's hard to wrap your head around specifically what happened. 'Cause, I mean, obviously we know what happened, right? We know there was a polling error. We know it was kind of similar to 2016, but not exactly similar to 2016. For example, in 2016, national polls were pretty bang on, right? They said Clinton would win about 3 points. She won by 2 points. Obviously, that doesn't translate to the electoral college, but most of the people probably listening to this understand that fact. But then you're looking at states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, to a lesser extent, Florida, North Carolina, those ones within the margin of error, you wouldn't really say they were bad polls. They're just not great, but they're not bad. But again, those kind of three states, I think we had, I think going back to 2016, I don't remember off the top of my head, I think we had a couple of bad polls showing Missouri kind of close. So again, not great there. But again, just kind of those three states where the state polls are really off. And a lot of people, myself kind of included, were like, okay, the state polls had some issues, but the national poll was pretty good. So again, a lot of our model specifically looks at the national poll and extrapolates down. And then this year, though, we had in a lot of places kind of the same error, right? Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. Obviously, and you mentioned in your article, the ABC Washington Post, Biden plus 17 in Wisconsin. Obviously, everybody was like, that's an outlier, but I don't think we thought it was going to be an outlier of that much, right? Like, it's almost a 17-point outlier, right? Biden won the state by like half a point, right? So there's some of them are the same polling errors and some of them are different. So why do you think we're seeing that? Like, why do you think? I mean, it's very clear that some of the errors happened in 2016. Pollsters didn't fix it, but now we're seeing some newer polling errors too. We're looking at a national polling error that's definitely wasn't there in 16, wasn't there in 18 even, and then we're even looking at states like, again, Texas wasn't the worst polling miss in 16, but horrible this year, right? Polls showing it close within a point. Trump went up by 5. South Carolina, Maine, like the Maine Senate just, but the press was fine. Like there's so many weird things that happened in terms of some of these other polls that didn't exist in 2016. Why do you think we're seeing a completely different error?
Well, I mean, I just think I don't think it has to do with the Americans' trust in polls. Just no one really takes part in polls anymore, and so it's hard to poll people who aren't, submitting themselves to be polled, and I think it leads to an oversampling because certain people will respond to polls and other people won't. Um, and so I think if you extrapolate the data, because that's what, there's nothing wrong with it when you extrapolate data, but when you extrapolate the wrong data, it leads to larger polling errors. And so we see that with like never Trumpers in the GOP. They try and they're more likely to respond to a poll, and most Republicans are notoriously less likely to respond to polls. So if you have, say, 10% of Republicans are never Trumpers, and say a quarter of Republicans that are asked to be part of a poll, only a quarter of them respond, and you take half of the never Trumpers, that's pretty much doubling what the actual never Trumper makeup of a poll is. And I think that's really where the issue lies, is people aren't taking part in polls. And I don't see that changing as we go forward.
Yeah, I mean that's definitely in terms of if you take when you're looking at a like when you're in the U.S. and you're looking kind of like a two-party system, and then you just kind of carve out a slice of one of the parties, then obviously the other parts will rebalance to make that bigger. So and again, I kind of do feel that is the case, right? When you look at some of these polls, there's definitely a slice of the electorate that is just not being captured by these polls, and we're really seeing that in a lot of states where it's kind of like when you, and again, we've been pointing this out a little bit on the podcast too. When you're like, at least we see it, and maybe not necessarily in the Midwest, but when we're seeing areas with higher, university educational attainment in the U.S., right? You look at those polls, Quinnipiac, again, some of these polls showed like a Biden plus 30 with that group, right? He won it by less than 10, right? And
Right.
that's a huge source of error that really hurt us at least. And I mean, again, we look more at the demographics, but on the other side, even if you're just doing state polling averages, that's going to massively mess that up anyways, right? So it's kind of a cascade error. Now, in terms of just kind of that like regional kind of like basically the regional piecing together of where these errors are. Some people have had the theory that the better the state was for Trump, the larger the polling error. Do you kind of believe that theory, or do you kind of think this is just kind of a uniform miss across the board?
Um, I definitely believe it to a certain extent. Um, you know, in terms of better for Trump, like Florida this time around, Biden was the RCP average before the election was Biden like +1 and Trump won by 4 points. That's a big shift. But then, when you look at Pennsylvania, the RCP average was dead on with the actual average. I mean, I think there is credence in uh, the better Trump does in a state, the bigger a polling error in the state.
Yeah, and I mean, I think people will point to there was a poll of Arkansas early on in the cycle. I think it was like September, which was like Trump plus 2, and I looked at it. I'm like, that's not true at all. But I mean, a lot of people, and I think we got a couple polls from like West Virginia, it's like an 18-point raise. It's like these are ridiculous, and I think this kind of points to. So that's why I think some people have that theory. But then when you kind of look at those toss-up states, kind of like the Florida, even to an extent Texas in there, those states had like those states. I mean, it depends on what you mean by good for Trump. Like, if good for Trump means Trump wins 50% of the vote, or roughly around there, then sure, okay. But generally, if a state's a toss-up, assuming that kind of thing of the better Trump does in a state, the bigger the polling error, those states still have pretty big polling errors. So like, there is some, like, again, like as you say, there is some truth to it, but that's not the that's not the only part in it. Like, there's other pieces to this puzzle rather than just, oh, okay, like in that case you'd expect like Biden to be leading in a poll of Iowa, like Idaho or something, right? Like that's, and
Yeah.
obviously we don't get polls of Idaho, but that's the thing, right? So it's a bit more complex, and like there's a lot of different pieces that are going to go in, and I think I've tried to wrap my head around it. I'm sure you probably have, a lot of other people and it's really hard to just kind of sit here and be like, point to one thing that's like, this was the problem. There are so many different levels to it, so many different pieces, and the only solution that I'm coming up to is like multiple different pieces of something, and we still don't have a great grasp of it. And I think we're not going to understand it fully until we start seeing some polls in some like midterm polls in like later 2021, and then we're going to start kind of comparing them and seeing what the issue with that is. So basically, we'll talk about kind of the demographic shifts, right? So we've talked about what went wrong in the election, but then kind of fueling that is what the results we actually saw. So do you want to kind of briefly summarize like the demographic shifts we saw just kind of across the map?
Yeah, I mean, the big one that kind of sticks out is the Hispanic voters, because they really helped Trump win Florida by a healthy margin and hold on to Texas by a healthy margin. But then on the other side, they helped Biden flip Arizona and keep control of Nevada. So it doesn't really make sense because, as in one of your articles, you pointed out that Biden didn't really lose that much support. Trump gained a lot of support from the Hispanic voters in specific counties, and et cetera, which is just weird to think about. Like, Trump got people to turn out that wasn't part of the coalition, which is like a white uh, demographic.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we wrote an article about Hispanics, and I think the only kind of analysis outside of that article I've seen about Hispanic vote is just basically like it swung towards Trump, which, like, true on the surface, but there's a lot more in-depth detail to it, right? I think I talked about Miami-Dade, and it was just something like, I can't remember the exact number. It was like 200,000 Hispanics showed up and just voted for Trump. It's like they just weren't there in 16 or 8. Like, they never showed up before, and then bam, they're here, right? And you see the same thing in southern Texas, and even in some of the other parts. But in the piece, I talked about kind of the unifying theory behind that is that areas that had lower educational attainment for Hispanics, you actually saw bigger shifts towards Trump. That's why suddenly those like Rio Grande counties, some of them even turned red massive shifts to Trump, kind of muted in some of the more educated Hispanic populations in kind of Arizona and New Mexico, and even to a lesser extent Florida. But again, education definitely seems to be playing into it, which is interesting. And even if you go back to 2020 for a second there, looking in some of those urban areas too. I think Metro Atlanta a little bit in in like deep urban Atlanta, kind of the more African American parts of it in Atlanta, those swung just a little towards Trump. And I mean, a lot of people just be like, "Oh, well, whatever." They've just maxed out the African American vote. But if you look at it a little closer, because African Americans do tend to have a lower educational attainment than white voters, but basically on par, slightly lower than Hispanic voters, we're definitely seeing a realignment along educational lines. And before it was with white voters, right? That was the big story of 2016, is that whereas before Democrats, specifically Obama, had been able to get out and kind of equalize that or kind of stem the tide of it, suddenly in 2016 there was this massive educated split with white voters, and now we're starting to see that appealing, that kind of trickling down to minority voters too. And the interesting thing I will say is that this appears to be functionally a US only phenomena. Like, we're not really seeing much evidence of this, or even kind of the polling areas that we're talking about in Canada or the UK. It's really just the US. And I mean, the interesting thing is we're going to have an election in Canada probably in a couple of months. We don't have it on a fixed timetable. Basically, the governor can the prime minister can just basically call an election when he wants, or when he loses, basically control the House of Commons, which we expect will happen soon. And that's one of the things I'm going to look for when we're looking at the data specifically. I'm going to look for those minority communities in Canada, and I have a list of ones I'm going to look for specifically right off the bat. But I want to see if those kind of get a same kind of shift that we saw in the U.S. If those actually swing towards the Conservative Party, or if they stay liberal. And that's something to really look out for me specifically in that. Now, a lot of your thing, in a lot of your article, you talk about kind of weighing polling average, which again everybody does, right? You obviously weigh for more accurate to the last election, and obviously to date, right? Obviously the more current polling averages, those ones those get obviously those obviously have the higher weight than ones that are older. But you talk a lot about, and I believe probably one of the reasons why you had the best model is because you included averages with Trafalgar and Rasmussen. So, and I think you had talked to me earlier about the fact that you disagreed. In our articles, we specifically stated we weren't going to include those partisan polls. Why do you think it's correct to, just if you could say the article for everybody listening, why do you think it's correct to include those pollsters rather than not include them?
Well, I mean, they obviously have a conservative Republican leaning bias, specifically Rasmussen. I think Rasmussen is without a doubt Republican boosting. But in that same article, you mentioned that we've seen in other polls a 5-point shift towards Biden. So I think it's good because it creates a more balanced a balanced compilation of polls, because there are polls that are much more biased towards Biden. I mean, the ABC News Washington Post had Biden up 17 points. That's ridiculous. In Wisconsin, Trafalgar had Biden up 1 point in Wisconsin. So looking at the compilations, it would seem like Trafalgar was, more heavy bias towards Trump, when in actuality it was more accurate than any other poll in Wisconsin. So I think if you're going to discount any conservative leaning polls because they're intentionally boosting Republicans, I think you have to discount Democratic leaning polls as well. And I think that just leads to a slippery slope where you're allowing bias to come into models. I think if you include as many polls as possible, it creates a more wealth of knowledge, because you're including a number of different polling tactics in percent of the electorate polled, because each poll has their different percentages of Democrats, Republicans, white, black voters that they poll. And I think a better compilation would be to include more polls than less.
Yeah, I mean, that is a fair point. And obviously you do want to include as many different polls as possible, right? But I will kind of say that I agree with a lot of what you said, but I also still have some kind of fundamental differences about it. For example, if you just assume, let's say, for example, that it's just theoretically that all polls had a five-ish point bias towards Biden, which like kind of they did, right? I mean, to an extent, if you look at the other polls, they did. But then if you then say Trafalgar, okay, well Trafalgar had Biden +1 in Wisconsin and some other results. So yes, if you included Trafalgar and then you weigh it and you put it in there, then yeah, it's going to drag Biden down a bit. So then you get more accurate. But if you make the assumption that every single poll taken in 2020 would have a 5-point Biden bias, but then you check Trafalgar and suddenly it's now only, say, a 1-point bias towards Biden, and you say, okay, well, there's a 4-point difference there, but that's literally just Trafalgar being 4 points better to Republicans, or say Rasmussen. Rasmussen obviously has the same kind of house effect too. Then is it correct to include that? Because that's kind of what I feel happens. I feel like there's these, like, obviously partisan Republican polls, and obviously there are some on the Democratic side too. Some of those internals, yeah, I don't completely trust a lot of those internals. But obviously ABC Washington Post, yeah, okay, the Biden +17, fine. If you could find a way to just kind of say, okay, fine, we're not going to trust a Biden +17 in a swing state poll. But then also, if you could just kind of exclude those, like ABC is a media organization. They don't have any, like, they don't want their polls to be bad, right? They're not trying to mislead their viewers. New York Times, right? Again, great pollster during 2018. In actuality, they actually underestimated Democrats in a lot of those House districts in 2018, right? So my concern is that if we're just kind of the reason why, like basically, in my opinion, it's like Trafalgar and Rasmussen bet on the outcome. They're like, we think Trump's going to do better, and then just because they got lucky with their shift, with their kind of pro-Trump bias, that they actually ended up closer. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it makes sense. Trafalgar wasn't that accurate in the midterm elections. Uh, looking at the Georgia runoffs, Trafalgar was they weren't consistent. I think a lot of their presidential polls were consistent when compared to the Georgia runoffs. It started out with both Republican candidates having a lead, then Loeffler as the only Republican candidate with a lead, then both Democratic candidates had a lead. It was just they were all over the place. So I think those polls have a much more tendency to just boost Trump. I have a main issue with like 538. Their pollster ratings, they don't make that much sense to me. So 538, they rate the pollsters like on an A, B, C, D scale. The ABC News Washington Post has an A plus rating, and they've gotten on their website they had 72% of the polls that they analyzed were correct. Rasmussen has 722 polls that 538's analyzed and had 78% correct and were a C plus. I don't see where that comes in terms of the ratings, especially when you looked at the predictive plus minus and the error in the polls. Rasmussen was less than a point off on the predictive, and ABC was a 1.5 point off. So I don't see a lot of reason to weight polls when it seems just so subjective in terms of what polls do you think they're making a shift towards Trump, so we should weight them less. I don't see much analysis there that I buy into.
Yeah, and there's a lot you hit on there that I really agree with, right? I mean, the thing is, when you're looking at the 538 pollster ratings, I actually have a lot of questions about them too. Um, Again, one of the things is I kind of feel that their mean reverted bias, or like the bias of like a 0.1, is kind of a bit too. I believe it's kind of a bit too long term of a thing. For example, I mean, I'm not sure if they've computed them for 2020 going forward yet. Maybe they have, maybe they haven't. I don't actually know. But like, unless the Quinnipiac bias is like D+3, like that's, to me, that's way too low for a mean reverted bias, right? And in terms of the scores that they've hit on, I know what you're talking about. They basically claim that they put basically added emphasis on polls that are basically very transparent with their methodology, which is, it's laudable. It's something you should generally try to do. But at the same time, though, if those same polls are wrong, right? And if one poll is kind of right and they're not like, I mean, again, there's some of the other ones that they're not the most forthcoming with their methodology, and like if they're right, then they're right, right? I mean, you shouldn't have to if it works, right? If what you're doing works, you obviously have your clients. You want to keep that kind of secure. You don't want people copying you, right? So yeah, I generally think that they should actually some of the other ones that they weigh lower should have a higher rating, right? There's a lot of problems I had with a lot of the 538 polling averages in 2022 in 2020, and um, I'm definitely going to look at it. Maybe we're going to do something about that. I think we need to do a lot more in terms of polling, and there's a lot more on this of like how to analyze this and whether to include a certain poll or downweight it or whatever, right? Obviously, bias polls are not an only U.S. phenomena. Obviously, we have some in Canada too, and obviously in the UK. Um, but it's hard because it still is hard for me to include a poll that we know is intentionally biased to a side, but we're including it to just kind of say, okay, well, we think the polls are biased a certain way, so we're going to include this poll to try to cancel out that bias. I think that's generally, I kind of think it's a little problematic to do that. But I mean, again, going forward, based on the era that we saw in 2020, I think we're really gonna have to look at that as kind of as an industry in terms of modelers. We're gonna have to look at that and figure out what the best path forward on that is. Um, if you were kind of replicating, making your own 538 polling ratings, what would you include for your polling ratings?
Um, it's a tough question. I haven't really thought about it. I mean, I think a lot of the polls, I mean, really what it comes down to is how much trust you have in a poll. Um, going into the 2020 election, I had no trust in any polls. I mean, I was just wildly confused. And you look at the crosstabs, it doesn't make much sense. Um, and so it's a hard line to draw. I definitely wouldn't rate Rasmussen and Trafalgar in the C's. I mean, I probably wouldn't rate them in the A's, in an A tier. But I do think that they're above average pollsters. And then there are some other good ones too. I think Quinnipiac is a really good poll, and PPP or other good polls. But there are some polls that you just look at the results and then look at the crosstabs, and they're just, I was very confused when I was looking at the polls. So if you don't have a lot of trust in polls, I think it's important to get a wide variety of polls because it helps create some type of balance. But if you do trust in the polls, I think it is definitely within reason if you want to exclude certain polls that obviously shift towards Republicans like Trafalgar and Rasmussen.
Yeah. All right. So just kind of one more question on this. What do you think about non horse race polling? So kind of like approval rating. I don't know. Did you include approval rating in your 2020 model or not?
No, I
No.
mean, we considered it a factor. Um, One of the things that really was a tipping point that we couldn't really trust polls at large was the uh, wasn't approval rating, but it was like are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? And 55% of Americans said that they were better off, which would, in most every case, lead to a landslide for the incumbent. Um, but then we're seeing polls with Biden up 10 points. So I mean, I had a hard time believing that there would be a massive shift towards Biden when 55% of Americans said that they were better off than they were, even during the COVID-19 pandemic when the economy was obviously in the tank.
Yeah, and that's an important point there too on that front because like a lot of the times when you looked at kind of these base kind of approval things of is the country going in the right direction, wrong track? If you look at better than you were 4 years ago, you look at the economy. A lot of these have been in past strong predictors of who wins the election, and they were like there for Trump. I mean, I'm not but landslide territory for some. I mean, obviously the better than 4 years ago that one was. Some of the other ones though not as great, but at the same time, those were still pretty good for Trump. They didn't lead to a 10-point loss for Trump, right?
Yeah.
and then suddenly you get these polls that say 10-point loss for Trump, and then all of a sudden it's just a 4-point loss for Trump with all these close states. And the thing is, one of the things that I looked at on it, we spent a lot of the time in 2020 dismissing these kind of fundamentals forecasts, kind of the economic fundamentals forecasts. Lesser extent approval rating, we kind of felt tied into national polls, which again, Trump was kind of 10-ish points underwater, so that kind of fits in with that. But when you look at what do you think about fundamentals forecasts? Like, do you like economic fundamental forecasts? What do you think about them? Do you think they have a place going forward? Because honestly, if you just kind of took that, average it with the polling, you'd probably get pretty close to what the actual result was.
Yeah, I mean, what I said in 2016 when I was talking with my aunt, who's very Democratic, people vote with their wallet, and I think there is a lot of credence. Like if COVID-19 hadn't happened, I don't see Trump losing a race because his one claim that was better was the economy, and historically, a good economy leads to re-election. So I do think that it's not the future of polling, but I do think it should definitely be an aspect um, in polling going forward.
Yeah, and it's an interesting topic to have on that because again, we have said in the past that and it is has been very true. People vote with their wallets, right? We talk about some of the famous moments from past historical campaigns, right? Bill Clinton saying it's about taxes, right? Like this is a lot of it has been about that, but at the same time, while I generally agree with you that if COVID hadn't have happened, could Trump have won? Maybe. I see where the argument is on that, but at the same time, when all those other numbers were actually still pretty good for Trump anyway, and he still lost, I don't know. I almost wonder if this was kind of like it was always going to be this close, and it didn't really nothing really mattered that much, right? And I get you definitely can get that sense from this, right? That in the fact that nothing mattered. People like there's basically half of America hated him, the other half of America loved him, and it was always just going to kind of end this way. And that depending on how you viewed Trump influenced your viewing of the pandemic. And I mean, obviously, I'm sure you can find a voter somewhere. Probably very easily. It's like I voted for Biden because Trump didn't handle the pandemic. Probably very easy to find that. But at the same time, would that person have been able to be peeled off? Because again, a lot of the focus of the campaign was on the pandemic, obviously, the second it hit. But if that wouldn't have been the focus of the campaign, would it have been on immigration? Would it have been on taxes? There's a lot of other focuses it could have been on. And if that voter who said Trump didn't handle the pandemic well, I'm voting for Biden, do you think that voter would have very likely would have just been peeled off for some other reason? Oh, I voted Biden because of Trump on immigration or something. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a good point. In my podcast leading up to the election, I said my main thing was that the election was a lot closer than the polls were indicating, and my model was indicating that as well. But the one, approval rating sore thumb that was sticking out to me was that Trump's approval rating was, although it was low and historically low, around 40 to 45%, it was always consistent. There was never much change, and so that to me showed that his base wasn't wavering. And what it meant to me was that it was going to be a campaign of the undecided voters, the independent voters who are going to decide the election. So I do think there is a good chance maybe some of the, Georgia historically close race, Wisconsin close, Arizona close. I do think that there is a possibility that if the pandemic hadn't happened, that you would see some voters either just not go out and vote for Biden or just vote for Trump instead, because Trump got 10 million more votes than he did in 2016. It was a historic, the most gain in popular votes for any incumbent president we've seen. So I do think that the support for Trump was there, and that the pandemic definitely played at least possibly a deciding factor.
So then, all right. Sorry, one more question. Then move off this topic. Do you believe those approval rating polls for Trump? Then, like, so again, you quote the numbers about 40. That was basically where it was. He basically oscillated between 40 to 42, 38 at kind of the valleys in and around um, the in Virginia, the basically the rally about the Confederate monuments. I can't remember the name of the city. Yeah, Charlottesville, right? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Um, do you believe those? Like, do you think that 40% was accurate, or do you think it was actually like 43%? Like, what do you think?
I think it was a little bit higher. Like Rasmussen, a poll's coming out that's saying it was 50% or 51%. That there's no chance of that being true. Um, but I do think it was a little lower than the actual predictions. I mean, my brother goes to school in Ohio, and so when we went up and dropped him off, we were going up through Ohio, and the amount of Trump signs that were there. I mean, you talked about in the article like yard signs. Um, uh, there's not like you can't gauge yard signs, but you can kind of get a sense of the support. There are so many yard signs for Trump, Trump signs on barns just everywhere. So I mean, from then on, I figured Trump would not have a chance of losing Ohio. I did not see Trump losing Ohio at all. Um, so yeah, I do think that the approval rating was a little bit higher than 40%, but kind of the same with the polling error we see towards Trump, right? I think that's part of the equation.
So then, in that case, do you believe the polling we're getting now showing with Biden's approval rating and Trump's approval rating at the door? Do you think those are biased as well?
Um, I don't think there's much bias when it comes to Biden. Um, Not because bias only affects Trump, but just because we haven't really seen much evidence for it yet going forward. Um, and I think most people, especially after what happened at the Capitol, they're happy that there's someone who's not starting Twitter beef on Twitter every waking moment of the day is in the White House. So I don't think that there's much bias there.
Yeah, yeah. Last thing on this, but the one thing I will say is that, and we talked about this in our last podcast, the current Biden's current approval rating with, or kind of Trump's disapproval rating, the last Quinnipiac. Again, we need more Biden approval rating polls. I'm not really commenting on Biden approval rating at this moment, but what Trump's were, and again, if we see Biden with 60% of approval of white college voters, that was what the poll said he was going to get of white college voters going into the election, and that he did not get that at all. So if we're starting to see 60, 63, 64% Biden approval rating with white college voters nationally, I'm skeptical. I think something is off there, and that's kind of a telltale sign that that maybe this is just kind of an inherent, that there is something fundamentally wrong with polling where they're missing a chunk of voters, right? So I mean, we'll see. Obviously, I want to see some polls. Obviously, we need to see 2022 polls. A Virginia governor poll would be great too. A lot of different things to see, and obviously once we start digging through those tabs, and as we get to, I mean, we're gonna have a bunch of special elections. We've got some Democratic House seats up. We'll have to see if there's shifts to the Republicans in those, if Democrats hold them, etc. A lot of different things coming up to see on that point. So definitely not the last thing we're going to talk about, bias and polling error. All right, so finally today, most important topic. We're going to talk about college football here for a second. So, pressing question: 4 or 8 team college playoff. What do you think?
Um, I actually think neither.
No.
I think 16 would be perfect. Um, my explanation for that is there's no real advantage to having a 1 seed versus a 2 seed, and specifically a 2 seed versus a 3 seed, right? Other than wearing a home uniform. Um, I think a 16 would give us an incentive to get a 1 seed and a 2 seed because you would get a bye in the first round. And then I think 18, I have an issue with 18 because there's a lot of the talk is automatic bids. Um, I While that may seem fine, I think it also leads to, what if in some crazy universe where like Alabama loses the SEC championship, Clemson loses the ACC championship, Ohio State loses the Big Ten championship, and so now you have, you know, worser teams from all those conferences getting in, and then plus those teams, I think it would lead to the same kind of 4 team makeup as we were.
Yeah, and I mean, I the thing is, I feel like the problem though with that though is that I feel like you're probably not gonna get all the conferences on board, because if you did 6 teams and then you said, okay, not automatic bids, and the Pac-12 is going to be kind of not happy with that.
Yeah.
Um, I will say though that the situation you raise is kind of important. I think that's why we can't actually have a 6 team playoff, is because if someone does lose, so basically assuming that that's the case, right? If you get 6 teams, what you're generally going to have is you're going to have the conference champion from each conference. That's 5, the Power 5, and then you'll get one kind of wild card team. Now this year that would have been like that would have been Notre Dame, right? So right off the top, okay, great. Now, so we basically just had this year's playoffs, except now we're going to throw in Oklahoma and Oregon, right?
Yeah.
And then there's a wild card. If Notre Dame has a good season, right? Notre Dame's still in a conference. They're just gonna like go 9-1 or something, lose to the best team on their schedule. Then they'll get in there, and then they'll be the 6th seed or something. But then you're still gonna have to debate about Texas A&M. Obviously, in this season, kind of Florida. Like, I mean, Florida. Obviously, they lost to LSU. They shouldn't have done that. Shouldn't have lost to Texas A&M either. But they were the team that gave Alabama the best run for their money all season, right? And
Yeah.
like, if you were to pick a team to beat Alabama this year, probably would have been Florida, right? Like, no one came close, right? And
Yeah.
my kind of proposal would be, because like I feel like if they're probably gonna make it just 8 automatically anyway. It's not gonna solve the problem. You need to go to something like 12. You need to go something like 12. Give the conference champions an automatic berth, and then you reward 1 through 4. You give the top 4 teams a bye. So then at that
Yeah.
point you kind of filter it out. You do that. I think that's kind of the better, because the thing is, you're gonna advance, maybe make a 6 or an 8, and then we're gonna be stuck with the same problems again because some conferences are gonna get left out or wild cards or something. But yeah, I think it's always these polarizing debates with college football, and we'll have to see what happens though. What do you think? What do you think about kind of about parity, right? Because the big kind of complaint we have is that it's always the same schools, right? It's Ohio State, Clemson, Alabama, always for the championship. What do you think about that? Do you think parity is? Do you think there is parity? Which kind of just kind of had a run of a couple good recruiting classes. What do you think?
Um, I think there's 2 sets of parity. I think there's parity with those 3 teams, and then there's parity with everyone else. So where you kind of see like a 4th team shuffle in almost every few years. Um, but I don't see any parity from the top 3 teams to even the rest of the top 10, which is why I think there's a legitimate reason to not expand the playoffs, because why would we want to see Alabama beat up on Cincinnati? Because Cincinnati isn't going to beat Alabama this year, because Texas A&M lost by 28, Alabama, Ohio State lost by 28. I think there's a good argument to not expand the playoff, which is why I think 6 teams is kind of good, because there's always debate about the 4th spot, because the 5 could take it. Sometimes there's 6 teams competing for those top 4 spots, but and we see 4 seeds win the playoff all the time. Ohio State did it, Alabama did it. So I think there's definitely a reason to have 4 teams, but I don't see a reason to expand it to 8 or 12, because they're not going to beat Alabama or Ohio State or Clemson, because they have runs of really good recruiting classes. But the big thing is player development. Those schools churn out players for the NFL like it's nobody's business, and that's not going to change anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, you look at NFL rosters, you can just be like, oh, this guy is from like, this, like, oh, this is like the Alabama team, right? It's like three,
Yeah.
like you see someone's offense, it's like, oh, there's like 3 Alabama players here, right? So it is they like, yeah, those schools are basically NFL factories, right? Like, and I mean, when they see a down year, right? Like Alabama, obviously this year won the national championship. Year ago they didn't. That's because they got decimated by the draft, right? Like some of these, like that's the we're at the point now where the draft is parity for some of these teams, right? Like the draft will come in decimated team, and then they'll have a down year because they just got completely decimated by the draft. One thing though is that in terms of the argument for if you expand the playoffs, then you incentivize people to be like, oh, I'm going to take a chance at going to Cincinnati because then I could play for in an expanded playoff. I could get into that playoff, or I'll go to like Tennessee or something because of the expanded playoff. You can. What do you think about that argument? That it could actually create kind of more parity. People are gonna, like, a lot of NFL quality prospects would take a chance at a school they like rather than just trying to go to like an NFL factory.
I think that's fair. I mean, we kind of see that in college basketball now, with players not going to Duke or Kentucky, but going to like LSU and Oklahoma State, schools that will allow them to play in March, but not uh, like, because the college basketball playoff tournament's not 4 teams. So I think there is some argument to that. I think if they did expand the playoffs, it would take 5 years at least to really see that happen, just because you don't go to college football and start right away. It takes time, and especially to build a program up. So I do think that's a possibility. I think one of the issues is college football is really impatient. So like after the four team expansion, 2 years later, there's already talk, but we need to expand it again. Um, so I think if we're patient and allow that to happen, it would be really good for the sport, and we would see an increase in parity. But I don't have faith that the college football fans will be that patient.
Do you think it was the right decision to have a college football season this year, given COVID and how badly it went for so many teams?
Yeah, I mean, the SEC played every one of their games. I think one of the issues was um, deciding not to do it and then backtracking, like the Big Ten did. Um, I mean, I don't think there was ever really a question that the SEC was going to play. I was talking to people over the summer that there's no way, Alabama, Tuscaloosa is a college football town. If there's no college football, the economy would lose literally billions of dollars. Um, so, I mean, from an economic perspective, yes, I think the SEC handled it better than any other conference. The ACC did a good job. I think the issue came in when people weren't confident. Um, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, on that kind of front, I think I kind of, my opinion was, because we got to opening week when you had the ACC and the Big 12 and the SEC playing, and then I kind of feel like they just kind of bullied the Big 12 and the Pac 12 the Big 10 and the Pac 12 into doing it. It's like, hey, we're here, we're playing. Why aren't you playing, right? And then all the pressure went on them. And I mean, obviously the virus is dangerous, and you don't want. I mean, we don't know the long term effects. I mean, we hope no one who caught it will be affected long term by it, but I mean, we don't know yet. So I mean, on one hand, yeah, it was nice to have college football. It was nice to be able to watch something on Saturday, but at the same time, we hope that all those people are fine. And if you would have wished, the NFL did a really good job at that. They had very few outbreaks. You would have wished that maybe the NCAA could have done something like that, but at the same time, it's very hard to do that. The NFL is a multi-billion-dollar thing. A lot of these schools, not that they don't have the ability to do that, and also, as you saw, a lot of college football teams, the second they kind of got blown out there and they weren't going anywhere fast, like Florida State, Michigan, a lot of those players kind of just were like they didn't care that much about the protocols anymore. I think they got themselves infected, and then games got canceled. So hopefully we won't have to deal with this again. But I think the NCAA needs to be a lot more careful and kind of impose a lot of restrictions on teams to kind of keep the players safe. So yeah, but I
Yeah.
mean, then you obviously have the economic arguments, right? So
Yeah.
it's interesting. So anyway, so well, thank you for coming on today. It's been
Thank you
really
for
fun,
having
and
me.
yeah, and we'll talk some more college football someday. We'll see.
Yeah, it'll
Uh,
be fun.
yeah. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.